All right. Well, welcome to the first lesson of the semester. And before we get into any kind of code, any kind of HTML or CSS or any kind of design really, we've got to get our development environment set up. And that's what this first lecture is going to be about, is setting up our development environments. And a development environment can be lots of different things. It can be very simple. It could be as simple as just a text editor and a text file. That could be your entire development environment. You just code into a text file. Other development environments could be much more complicated, so they could include entire IDEs or application development environments that have text editors and code help windows and ways to push your code up to the internet. Probably one of the most popular IDEs in design is Dreamweaver, and Dreamweaver is a piece of software that is kind of like a really, really fancy text editor, and it allows you to edit text, edit CSS, and it also lets you create sites and upload all that content to the web. So it's a good way to manage the entire workflow of your site. The problem with Dreamweaver is it has a WYSIWYG function. WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. And for those not familiar with WYSIWYG, what a WYSIWYG is it's like a kind of a pseudo text editor, but what you're actually doing is you're manipulating images and blocks of text and titles and font sizes and kind of building what you want to see visually, and you're allowing Dreamweaver to write the code. We do not want to allow Dreamweaver to write code. We don't want this. If anyone's going to be writing code, it's going to be us. So if you're going to use Dreamweaver as a development environment, you want to make sure that you're only using the text editor portion, because the text editor does work quite well, but we want to make sure we're writing our own code from scratch and we're not letting the system generate code for us. That'll make our job a lot easier on the end in terms of debugging our code, and it'll also make things a little more simpler to fix problems, because we can take out a lot of different variables. So Dreamweaver is one option. I believe all the lab computers in ComArts have some level of Dreamweaver, some version of Dreamweaver running on them. So if you're comfortable with Dreamweaver and you know Dreamweaver, then by all means choose Dreamweaver. I will not be using Dreamweaver in lecture to give examples. I will be using a hybrid of a browser and just a plain old text editor. And I'm going to talk about my development environment. Okay, so a simpler way to do development, and also just a quick note that I run on a Mac, and all the examples you see here are going to be run on a Mac. If you have a Windows machine, that's okay. It's not a big deal. So most of the examples you're going to see in this class are going to be on a Mac. And if you have any questions about how that translates back to Windows, or if you can't quite figure out a function on Windows, just let me know outside of class and I can help you with that. So my development environment consists really of three main parts. I have a text editor, and my text editor is called Textmate. And Textmate just recently got open sourced, so now it's an open source piece of software. I think it's free now, but you'll have to check. I'm not really sure. But what Textmate is basically just a fancy text editor, and it allows me to open up my entire project. This is like a little directory view that you'll see, and it code completes for me and does syntax highlighting. So it's really nice. So this is all Textmate is fancy text edit. That's all it is. Okay, so that's the main part of my development environment. This is where I do most of my work. The second part of that for any web designer, so this is number one, is the web browser. Can't do any web design without the web browser. This is the programming equivalent of compiling and running your code to make sure it works. So as we're designing, we need to be testing our code in a web browser. We need to make sure that our logo and all of our content looks the way it's supposed to on the page. So you'll see a lot in the upcoming examples that I'll be jumping between a text editor and a browser window, a text editor and a browser window. You'll jump to the text editor, you'll make a really quick change in text, and then you'll jump back to the browser to see how that change works. Okay, so far we've got a text editor, we've got a browser, and the third part of my development stack is Git. And Git is a piece of software. So actually, the third part of my development environment is actually two things. It's Git plus GitHub, and you really can't have GitHub without Git. So they kind of go one and the same. And Git and GitHub serve two purposes for me. First and foremost, Git is a version control system, and a version control system takes our code and as we're working on our project, it commits versions of our code. So we might write the content for the homepage of our website and then commit that code. So now I have one commit. So we'll just com1 for commit, and that is my homepage. And then I continue working for a few more hours, and I do all of the imagery. And then I commit again. We'll call that commit number 2, and that's all the site images. So what Git is doing is it's taking a little snapshot of how my project looks at each of these stages, and it goes on and on and on and on, and it captures all the versions of my document. It even allows me to branch off into different versions, and it can get very, very complicated, but very, very powerful. So the main benefit of this is a backup. We always want to have a backup of our code. So Git allows us to take a snapshot of the code we're working on, save it locally, and then also send it up to some remote server for backup. So this remote server holds our code in two different places. So if something happens to our main machine, we've got a backup, and heck, if something happens to our main server, we have a backup locally. So the great thing about Git is that it's distributed, and it allows you to put your code in lots of different places and also share that code with lots of different people. And that's kind of where GitHub comes in. So some of you guys may recognize the Octocat, and that's the GitHub mascot. And the GitHub mascot kind of represents exactly what this image shows here, is that GitHub is for sharing, and Git is really for sharing. And it allows teams of developers and designers to all collaboratively work together on a single project. So not only is Git and GitHub going to help you stay more organized within your project, but it's also pretty much the standard for interacting with designers and developers in the professional design industry. So for instance, if you want to go, say, work for a startup in Silicon Valley and you want to do front-end design, you're most likely going to be working with a Git repository, and you're going to want to know how to pull down that Git repository, how to get access to those files, and then how to share your work with the team. So the next video is going to spend most of its time on Git and GitHub, and we're going to show you how to get it set up. I'm going to explain a little bit more about version control, and then I'm going to show you how this entire development environment comes together. So just for a quick recap, Dreamweaver and other integrated development environments are fine. I prefer that you not use the features of these programs that create the HTML for you. I want you writing your own HTML and CSS by hand. A better way to do development is kind of a hybrid method with a good text editor, a good browser, and some kind of version control backup deployment system, which Git takes care of. That's Git's role in our current setup. So this is the development environment that I'm going to encourage this semester, and the next few videos are going to describe exactly how this works and how you can set it up on your own.